I have a couple to cover there. And if we have time, we'll let Todd talk about PowerShell. I'm really hoping that Mark will be as verbose as he often is, and we'll leave Todd maybe a minute and a half, and then we'll have to cut him off.
I can fit a lot of PowerShell goodness in a minute and a half.
I'll talk really slow.
All right, it's 12:30, people, so we should get going. It's August 7th. This is Ask in Praxis. We are missing the Cash Petersons. Derek and Patrick are on vacation, so we don't have them today, but we do have the rest of the team. So happily, we will cover Microsoft 365, SharePoint, Term Store, and Metadata. So we have a lot of bullet points here. We're going to talk about what the Term Store and Managed Metadata is, how that managed metadata is related to information architecture. Mark is definitely going to go through ways to manage the term store and security considerations around it. Known issues, I have a couple to cover there. And if we have time, we'll let Todd talk about PowerShell. I'm really hoping that Mark will be as verbose as he often is, and we'll leave Todd maybe a minute and a half, and then we'll have to cut him off.
I can fit a lot of PowerShell goodness in a minute and a half.
I'll talk really slow.
Thanks, Carrie. I thought you were on my side. I
totally.
Carrie's not. No.
She's on your side, but she's not going to give you time to talk.
Carrie, help lead us on the way. What is the term store?
Lead us under temptation.
Slowly. So very slow.
Okay, so the term store in SharePoint is just basically a central repository for commonly used terms, right? And it just sounds like a very super simple definition, but it's just a way for us to use the same language when we're working in SharePoint. So it provides a tenant-wide source of terms, and it's organized in this hierarchy to sort of categorize things that people can use to tag content consistently across the internet, which all sounds great, but like, what's the benefit of that? Like, why do that? Why is that important? And it really just starts to bring people more toward this common vocabulary. That consistency in how data is categorized in turn makes it sort of easier to organize and really find information. So that's really the goal, right? Is so that we're tagging these things, and for what reason we want to be able to find them more easily down the road. Sometimes it's great to think about all this up front, but as you're working with different groups, you realize that sometimes the terms aren't always the same. And so really, this is one of the hardest parts, is getting people to sort of agree with what those terms are. So just a quick example for that, some departments, like we've seen in some recent projects, use the term policy, and others might use guideline. And so trying to align with different groups to understand what's the most common term and what can we agree upon for what that term is, and like what the definition of that really means. Same thing for like procedures and processes and work instructions. I mean, there's a ton of these that are kind of interchangeable, and time goes by, groups evolve, and people tend to use them interchangeably, but it's really important to kind of know what that common naming convention is.
So this is that synonym property, right?
Yeah. And so one of the ways a good idea, I guess I could just say, to try to do that up front is to try to understand the content that you're working with and how people reference that. So identifying some key stakeholders, having some review sessions, trying to like tease out what it is that they call these different things and agree upon what those are. And also looking at it from the lens of like site admins versus any end user or site visitor, because they might look at things a little bit differently. And so yes, something that can really help with that is the use of synonyms. And so the term store gives you this ability to add some alternate labels to terms that other people might use, that you're maybe not so much steering them away from, but you're trying to get to this common set of terms, but also meeting people sort of where they're at. And so another example of that could be, let's say you have a term set that has all of your different document types. And in finance, you're calling them purchase orders, but people are thinking as, PO. So you could have PO as your synonym for, the correct actual term of purchase order. Same thing with job titles, vice president, having a synonym for VP. So it just helps kind of bring that whole process.
And speeds data
along,
entry,
yeah.
right? So like we had an example where we were working together on a project and they had names of locations, and because they were named in honor of people, they were these huge long names,
Right.
like
Right.
5 or 6 long words to mean this location. And so they had shortcuts for sure. And typing in that whole long name or even the beginning of it was kind of, annoying and cumbersome, but they wanted it tagged with the real name, the real location. So that can also just be a shortcut for data entry, also known as, but also a data entry shortcut if you had some like shortcuts for those terms.
Yeah, and the cool thing is that when someone's tagging that document or putting a selection in that list column, for example, SharePoint sort of pulls up the actual term and you can see that synonym tied right there with it. So it kind of connects the dots, I guess, between the two and maybe helps for furthering that along across the intranet. So it is kind of cool.
Yeah. There's also translations, which is where I notice what's going on in the chat. Casper, you're talking about using multiple languages. And so there's synonyms, which are one thing, but there's also translations, which is a different thing as far
What
as
other
like,
languages? There's only English.
It does feel that way.
I barely get that right.
I'm kidding. You know that, Casper.
But yeah, so, and once the term sets are sort of created and maybe you've added those synonyms, like how do you use them? How do you use this term store in SharePoint? And so this last bullet just kind of talks to how do you sort of bring that into what you're doing. And as a site owner, you can manage this by basically creating some managed metadata columns in, say, a library or a list and connect that up to those term sets that you've created, giving people those options that you prefer them to pick. So the way it works is you basically just pick a level in which you want those terms to sort of display. So you can start at the top. You may want to start at the term set or maybe even a subterm. Yeah, and this slide really depicts that. And as a site user, you are just essentially tagging the items with what you're provided based on how it was set up. So yes, this slide sort of shows the taxonomy of this and this sort of classification of how you can kind of group and classify all these different terms. So when you go to the term store in general, there's some out of the box term sets already sort of predefined for you. And not to get too into it, but I know there's people, search directories, and what's the other one? System, I think it's system. So those are geared more toward specific things like for individual people, ways to improve search. You may have some terms that align with that. And system, I think, is just more about functionality, like maybe your content types or things that are standard across your environment. Outside of those out of the box term sets that you get, you can customize them in like what this example is showing, which is just a couple of different layers down. So in this particular one, our term group is the company. So that's Excellent Insurance. And that's that sort of high level collection of all the term sets. And then under that, you can see how it's indented. We've got our different term sets. So applications is one, but you might have departments or locations or regions or things like that. So it's sort of a hierarchy in that now that you have this applications term set, you can start adding the tags that apply to that. So as you can see here, Adobe agency portal, and I think it says bond builder. Those are those different applications. You can then go a level deeper and have some subterms. So even under Adobe, you might even have Reader or Acrobat. So you can kind of start stacking them in that way. And you can see the icons are a little bit different too. You've got the folder for sort of that top level. And then the term set has sort of like the multiple tags. And the terms are just that single sort of tag. So organizing stuff in this way, I think, really helps. And obviously, it's a good building block for your information architecture, which I'm sure Mark is going to dive more deeper into. But
we're going to let him. I think we're going to let him. Yeah. We'll give him a slide or two or 3.
Carrie didn't talk slowly enough. So
Yeah, God, we're giving Todd plenty of time.
I know,
at this
too
point.
much time.
Jesus.
this
Thanks.
is a slide that I
coffee.
use when I do sessions about information architecture, and these are all of the things that I think of as being part of information architecture in SharePoint primarily. And I've highlighted managed metadata up there in the upper right. Managed metadata is how you access managed metadata columns in lists and libraries is how you access the content that's in the term store. Managing the term store is a content job. Even though it's in the SharePoint Admin Center, it really ought to be managed by somebody who sort of has that librarian holistic viewpoint. Lots of times IT is the set of SharePoint admins, and that's not necessarily how they think. I'm not picking on them this time, but it's not always the right place to have that management. So managed metadata is one big piece of your information architecture. It's a way to bring consistent tagging, consistent metadata application to content across your many sites. You can build term sets and term stores in a local site, but generally speaking, we tend to put them in at the tenant level because that gives us that reuse. So it fits in with a lot of these other things. Content types can have managed metadata columns. Lists and libraries can have managed metadata columns. Pages can be tagged with managed metadata columns. So you're building something, in your term set, in the term sets that you build in the term store that fit into the other pieces in your information architecture. And that's all I have to say about that.
All right, that's it.
No, but I got another slide. Now I can talk more. So when I realized that I've totally skipped the different languages piece in these slides, Casper, and Casper reminded me. My bad. We do tend to be very English centric in the United States, and it's one of our less attractive qualities. But I'll talk about it a little bit, even though it's not on the slide. So when you're managing the tenant term store, you have to be a SharePoint admin. So you have to be able to get to the SharePoint Admin Center. You can also get to the local term store through site settings. So you have to be a site owner in order to get to that particular set of settings. The reason why you might choose a tenant versus a site level term set, I'll talk about in a minute. You have to explicitly be added as an admin for the term, for either the taxonomy or a term group or a term set, or else you can't make changes. So even if you're the SharePoint admin, you can't just go in there and start adding terms. You actually don't see the little dots. You have to add yourself as a manager of the taxonomy. I've beaten my head against that so many times. It's crazy. It's like, why don't I have permission? You have to give yourself explicit permission.
I did that wrong yesterday.
Probably this week for me. So one of the first things I always do is create a term group for the organization. In this picture, it's Simpraxis. It's a top level term group under which I tend to hang all of the term sets for the organization. I just find that works out well because the next layer down, as Carrie said, is then a term set. So you can see down there, we have term sets like benefit, month, organization, vendor, year. And then each of those has terms underneath it. I find that layering tends to work well. You want to make sure that you're setting admins at the right level, meaning that you can give permissions at different nodes in that taxonomy. So it might be that I'm going to let Casper manage the benefits term set, and Julie's going to manage the organization term set, and that's it. They don't get permission to do other stuff. That said, you have to be able to get to the SharePoint Admin Center to manage this, so it's a little crazy, but you definitely want to think about whether or not the management of the terms should be democratized. It's sometimes hard to get to, but it's a good thing if you can let people manage terms as content, not think of it as like an IT configuration. And then one last thing to mention here is that you can import term sets. So you could build a big spreadsheet of terms and their hierarchy and then import it. If you've already created a term set, you can't import on top of that. So it's only if you're starting from scratch. And there's actually a button that's off the side a little bit here for import, and it gives you a template, and you can use that template to add terms. Though I think Todd may talk about another way.
No, we won't.
If we let him.
No.
So finally, every term, this is the language part, every term can have translations. So I can say, you know, in my tenant, in this tenant, the default language is English. But for a term, I can go into its advanced settings and I can say that I want to add the French term for, you know, a French translation for that. Each of those translations can have their own synonyms. So vice president in English has VP as its synonym. In French, it would be something président. I don't know exactly what it would probably be vice president. So, but it might have a different synonym, right? So you can manage a rather complex set of terms across languages with synonyms, so that you're creating a very robust vocabulary for the content that you're tagging. The other thing that you can think about there is something that Dan asked, which is custom properties. Frankly, Dan, I've never used them, because you can enter custom properties on a term, but there's no way to access that except for programmatically. I would love it if we could have a term set, for example, for offices, and then have the custom properties be things like their address. It's almost like making a list out of a term set, or out of a term. But that isn't the way it works. I think the custom properties is probably something that, I mean, they built all of this back in SharePoint 2010 and did a pretty good job at it. It's very robust and convoluted the way they built things. And unfortunately, they never really went much further with it until they started building syntax. And then they started automatically adding terms and things like that. But it still could use a lot of enhancement around custom properties, as an example. Okay.
Managing terms?
Managing terms. So this is an ongoing activity. You don't just set up a bunch of terms and then walk away forever, just like you don't just set up search and walk away forever. You don't set up your information architecture and walk away forever. This is an ongoing thing. So you want somebody to have this role. There are a couple things that are worth mentioning in what you can do with individual terms. One of the biggest ones that I think is really important to know is, just like with most metadata values, you don't want to delete them because they might be in use with something. So if you've tagged something with the Boston office and then you remove that term, that thing will become untagged. It won't have a managed metadata value. That's bad. So what you want to do instead is deprecate that term. And what deprecate does is it leaves everything alone, but it doesn't allow you to tag anything new with that value. So it's a much safer way to handle things than deleting. If you put in a bunch of terms and you realize you don't need them and nobody's tagged them before, use delete. But otherwise, if there's even the possibility that somebody's used them, deprecate. Pin and reuse are interesting because essentially in different term sets, you may have a lot of terms that are very similar or the same, but you don't want to add them in two separate places. So for example, you might have a list of departments and a list of career paths, and they're almost the same, but one has a few more terms than the other. So reusing means, all right, I've got finance over here. I want to have finance over here too. But if we change the name of finance, I want to only change it in one place, and it's going to make the two the same. Pinning is a little different in that it isolates the changes that you make in the original location, whereas in reuse, you can add children in either place. And then merge is another really nice capability. Oftentimes, two concepts come together. Like maybe you have a benefits department and a compensation department, and they merge together to become HR. You don't want to have to go and retag all of that information. You can combine those terms together and rename the remaining one, and then everything just automatically gets changed. Same thing with rename term. You can, if HR becomes the people department, which I've actually seen happen, you can just change that term. And then Julie will talk in a moment about what happens when you do that.
Oh, well, I can talk about that right now, I think.
How about now?
So we have some known issues. There were more, but they've sort of cleaned themselves up. So we originally, when the term store first came out, the document information panel, which is the desktop version of the Office clients, didn't support managed metadata, and it was a real bummer because it meant that you wanted to use managed metadata in your document libraries, but then you couldn't see them as properties or update them as properties in your documents that were in those libraries, and it was a real miss. But that has been fixed, so that is not on our known issue list. I wanted to just point out from earlier, Mike Dixon put in the chat a pro tip that once someone is added to a tenant level term set as an admin, they can go into the site, any site that they are an owner of, and be able to work with the term set from there. They don't have to navigate to the term store in the admin center. And so that's a very cool thing to share with people. And so yes. Yeah, for sure. So then the other thing to know about sort of is that the APIs that we had for SharePoint are deprecated. So we have SharePoint RESTful APIs that are available, but they were only reads and no ability to update. So they are deprecated. You can still do reads and such, but you can, if you want to do updates, you need to use the graph. And if you move to the graph, it is a not as robust a set of APIs that did exist with the SharePoint one. So it's sort of an unfortunate situation we've been left in. We can now update terms and term sets and all those things, and add and delete and all of those things with the graph, but we're missing some of the key capabilities about like getting a set of terms in their children and sort of navigating term sets. The PMPJS library added a helper method that we call get all children as ordered tree. That's basically does a lot of the work for you, like inside of a helper method. So it's not just a one REST call, it does multiple REST calls to get all the stuff and then organize the term sets and the terms into an ordered list. But it's a tricky set of code. So just be aware that the APIs are sort of not as robust as they used to be, but on the plus, we can now update, delete, add, etc. So I left way too much time. So Mark, let's just talk about something completely different, right?
What did you do on your holiday?
Well, it was a great holiday, but all right, gosh darn it. I guess I'm going to have to let Todd talk. Go ahead, Todd. You have the floor.
All right. So the other folks have done a great job warming y'all up for this slide. Part of it is that you can get to the term store with the graph, and then there's other, languages that are built on top of that. So kind of the main takeaway from this slide is this is another example where you get to use PowerShell to do your work. If you don't want to do, JS or any of those other, certainly fine and beloved to those that love them technologies. Kind of what I wanted to bring in here is, since the two modules that I've ever used, actually I've only ever used one. I've only ever used the PNP PowerShell to interact with the term store, but the graph and then the graph SDK, which is the PowerShell module for the graph, they use two different words for the same stuff. So kind of the takeaway from this slide is, if you're using the graph SDK, then you want to look for the terms that have, or the commandlets that have term in them, because it's term store. But if you're using the PNP PowerShell, those same ones show up as taxonomy. So if you want to export things, import things, and all that, those are kind of the two tools that I use. They're handy for. Mark talked about how in the interface you could do an import and an export, those kind of things. If you're a PowerShell kind of guy or gal, you can use PowerShell for that kind of thing. And kind of two of my favorites when I'm talking about things I've done with PowerShell is the export and the import. So these are handy if you've got like a test environment and a dev and a production environment. You can export production, import it into test, and then do all your tests and those kind of things with it. And then also when I've done migrations, we were talking in the chat about how abandoned terms and things like that are hell on migrations. I've used add PNP taxonomy field to create, to add fields. And actually, term set is the one I would use to add the term set. Taxonomy field I added because if you're creating a list with PowerShell, Mike Dixon, have a test environment. If you're building a list with PowerShell, you're probably used to the whole add PNP field, which adds, certain fields and all that. If you want to add a field to your list that pulls back from the term store, you have to use add PNP taxonomy field. There isn't a taxonomy type of field to add. But I should have put on there add PNP term set, and that will let you add your term sets, term group, all that kind of stuff. But remember, PowerShell is fully represented when you're doing your interactions with the managed metadata or term store. So go out and PowerShell.
I use export PNP taxonomy a lot because if you've built a pretty robust term store and you want to sort of see it, the UI doesn't work very well, especially if you've got more than a few dozen terms, or if you want to, create, you want to do something else with those values, like talk through them or whatever. So export PNP taxonomy is nice. What it does is it gives you a pipe separated hierarchy of every term, which you can then, you can split apart in Excel or whatever. But it's just very helpful. Like if you wanted to have a whole term set in a PowerPoint slide, for example, and you can get somebody to run that commandlet for you, it's great because you can specify specific terms or specific term sets, etc.
Dan was talking about earlier in the chat, Dan Taylor was talking about how he has a separate SharePoint list to keep the list of terms so that you could visualize them. And I was sort of saying, yeah, you could build that with a SharePoint framework web part as well. So, I mean, there's a lot of ways to get it out. It's kind of sad that there's no visualization tool that's readily available, but it's what it is. All right, resources, people. We have a bunch of them. And because I am sharing from PowerPoint, these are clickable. So go ahead and click away. We have a upcoming Ask Sim Praxis on August 21st, and we have decided to continue the managed metadata term store sort of topic, and we're going to talk about using SharePoint managed metadata for search. So that is our next topic on August 21st. The CS Live has sort of slimmed down just a little bit. Somebody over-edited this, and I will beat them later. Don't worry about it. Next week, Derek, Mark, and I will be in Washington, D.C. for TechCon 365. So Collab Days New England is coming October 18th. If you are in the New England area, we would love to have you there. We are just finalizing our list of speakers, getting everyone selected, added to an agenda. And as soon as we have that completely consolidated, we will open up attendee registration. So be on the lookout for that in the next few weeks. And then finally, December 2nd through 6th, ESPC in Stockholm, Sweden. Mark, Derek, and Patrick will all be there for that. And so with that, we finished 1 minute early. We're going to have a company meeting about going longer so that Todd doesn't get to speak next time, people. I mean, come on. We have standards. We have standards to upkeep, and we let it go. All right. Well, thank you, everyone, for joining us. We hope to see you on the 21st. Take care. Thank you so much for joining us this week on Ask Sim Praxis. We love getting your questions or session ideas. You can submit by using the link in About. If you find this helpful, hit that like or subscribe button and share this content with your colleagues.